Hello, and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Japanese Studies at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of East Anglia. I'm your host, Oliver Moxham, Research Project Coordinator at the Sainsbury Institute and researcher of language and Japanese war heritage. This week we are joined by Viviana Andreescu, Associate Professor of Justice Administration at the University of Louisville, to discuss public opinion on capital punishment in Japan. Viviana's 2020 article, Public Opinion and the Death Penalty in Japan, took a look at over 2,500 responses of the Japanese General Social Survey to gauge who supports the death penalty and who would recommend it as a member of the relatively new citizen justice system. We hope you enjoy the show. Okay, good afternoon, Viviana. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So first of all, we'd like to know a bit more about you. Can you tell us about your area of expertise and how your interests have brought you there?
Sure. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Louisville right now. And my research focus is on violent crime, violent victimization, and fear crime, but also my research interest includes social justice issues as they relate to social minorities, such as immigrants, sexual minorities, or ethnic and racial minorities. My dissertation was based on a spatial and statistical macro-level analysis of the effects of various structural and cultural factors on homicidal violence in Appalachia, which is a large area in the United States. It includes over 1,000 counties and goes through 13 states from New York to the south on the eastern part of the country. I conduct pretty much quantitative comparative studies, and most of them are based on empirical tests of criminological theories. My interest in death penalty and public attitudes toward death penalty started in the 90s. And during my graduate studies at the University of Louisville, two of my professors, Tom Kyle and Gennaro Vito, were exploring at the time death penalty issues in Kentucky. Kentucky is one of the U.S. states that still retains death penalty. And they're both very generous, and they share their data that I later use for my master thesis. I was interested to see what characteristics have people who support or oppose death penalty, but I was more interested in seeing if people would change their opinions if given the opportunity to choose between an alternative sentence to death, which would be life in prison without the possibility of parole. And in the particular survey that I use, the question actually asked respondents if they would select this and restitution to the victim's family being made. And about 70% of the respondents initially expressed support for death penalty, but then when asked to select the additional alternative, more than half of them changed their opinion. So in the end, about 38% in the entire sample show support for the death penalty. And I'm mentioning that because many people who examine the correlates of attitudes toward death penalty argue that the structure of the questions actually reflect something that might not be exactly close to reality. So for unknown reasons, I was always fascinated with Japan and the beauty of the country and its culture. And I guess curiosity prompted me more than anything to try to understand why a pacifist country like Japan, a country that is, the safest in the world, a country that, based on my readings, has a cultural affinity for nonviolence and a very low tolerance for anger and aggression, would still retain death penalty. I had a chance to find data and to get some answers to my question.
I see. Fascinating. So let's begin with putting the death penalty in Japan into context. Most developed countries have abolished the death penalty, with Japan, the USA, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea being the notable exceptions. These systems vary from country to country, so could you explain what Japan's judicial process is on these matters?
Yes, I will try. Yeah, you're right. Most of the countries in the world right now abolish death penalty in law or in practice based on Amnesty International data. There are about 108 countries in the world that abolish death penalty in law, and overall 144, as I said, so that's about 70% of the countries that even if they didn't abolish, many of them didn't impose death penalty for more than 10 years or had moratorium on death penalty. South Korea, for instance, that retains death penalty statute, didn't execute anybody in the past 25 years. In the United States also, death penalty exists at the federal level, but out of 50 states, 23 abolished death penalty, 23 plus District of Columbia. So in the United States, support for death penalty tends to decrease a little bit. Not the same thing happens in Japan. And Japan, it's interesting because centuries ago, it was the first country in the world that actually abolished death penalty. And for about 300 years, in the 9th century up to the 12th century, nobody was executed in the country. In Japan also, it was a 40-month moratorium between 1989 and 1993. And I suspect some people hope that this might happen again in recent years, because there are now executions about two years between December 2019 and December 2021. Nobody was executed in Japan. However, 4 months after the new prime minister was elected, 3 people were executed on December 21st last year. Now, to go back to your question, criminal offenses committed by Japanese citizens who are 20 years old or older, so people are younger than 20 are minors in Japan, are judged and penalized according to the penal code enacted in 1907. And there are several other acts that regulate punishments for specified crimes, of course, like in any country. The most common crime in the United States, in Japan, based on statistical information, are property crimes, thefts in particular. Murders, like in any country, are rare events. And Japan has probably one of the lowest murder rates in the world. For instance, in the United States right now, in the past 2 years, the murder rate increased, unfortunately, and it's now similar to the murder rate in the 90s, so about 6.4 people per 100,000 individuals have been killed. While in Japan, 1/3% per 100,000 people have been killed. So in other words, if 3 people out of 1 million people are murdered in Japan, in the United States, there are 64 people who are killed out of 1 million people. Wow. The criminal justice system in Japan was affected by some change a bit more than a decade ago. So in 2009, a new mixed jury system was created in Japan. The purpose of this initiative was to increase civic engagement in the criminal justice system and to increase the democratic procedures and to decrease bias, I suspect. And this lay assessor system, or Saiban-in, It's, however, different from the jury system in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Under this new system, 6 lay judges, which are randomly selected from electoral rolls, sit alongside 3 professional judges and hand down rulings by majority. That means that out of 9 people, if 5 recommend the convictions, this is going to take place. However, in this group of 5, there needs to be at least 1 judge. And smaller panels, so that include 4 lay judges and 1 professional judge, may be also used when the facts identified during pre-trial procedures are undisputed. Like, when a defendant confesses committing to the crime, they can have smaller panels. The role of the lay judges, however, are constrained, and legal interpretations and determinations remain with the professional judges. And in any judicial decision, professional judges have a veto power. Defendants can be sentenced to death by district courts, and like in the United States, they have the right to appeal the decision, and the case moves to a superior court, to a higher court, and then to the Supreme Court. I don't know much about the right of appeals. I don't know how many appeals in a capital case defendants have the right to pursue, but it looks like it's more than 3. For instance, one of the defendants who died in prison, he was 89, and he died 5-6 years ago. Claiming his innocence, he was pursuing his 8th appeal. So the data varies, so I can be 100% sure what's the correct number. But Japan's Innocent Project, that keeps data on death penalty in Japan, lists right now 118 people on death row. 8 of them are women, 6 of them are foreigners and non-Japanese convicts, and 5 of them committed a crime as minors, so they're younger than 20 when they committed the crime. So there aren't too many. It's a pretty low number, especially comparing that figure to data from United States, where there are now about 4,500 people on death row, and 44 of them federal death row.
I see. So just to get the Japanese system right in my head, so you have civilian judges, and do they recommend the sentence? Do they just decide whether someone is innocent or guilty, like in the juries?
They recommend a sentence, and as I said, if 5 of them agree, for instance, and they say, well, we vote for death penalty, then this is a conviction. And you have lay judges in district courts, but in the upper level courts, you do not. So at higher courts, there are 3 judges, and they can appeal the decision there too. And it moves to Supreme Court that has 5 judges. So there are no lay jurors in those courts.
I see. It seems like quite a lot of responsibility to put on a civilian compared to what we do in Western juries.
Yes, this is true. And it's interesting that I was reading a couple of years ago that more than 1 million people in Japan have been asked to serve as a lay judge, and about 90,000 of them up to 2019 served, but many didn't want to, found reasons to avoid serving as a lay judge. So those who eventually agreed to do that, I don't know how representative they are of the entire population. So might be a process of self-selection. And something that also was interesting was that after the system was instituted in Japan, sentences became harsher than they used before. So that's why I suspect that people who agree to serve might be those who think that, crime is increasing in Japan and that harsher punishment should be imposed.
Interesting. So on that note, high-profile cases, such as the Aum Shinrikyo cult leader Shoko Asahara, who was responsible for the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin attack, these cases invariably lead to a death penalty verdict. But what types of crimes in Japan generally leads to prosecutors seeking the death penalty?
Yeah, you're right. Those high-profile cases that involve multiple murders are more likely to get the death penalty. And in Japan, and according to their penal code, murder, in particular aggravated murder, is eligible for the death penalty. So the prosecutor can seek the death penalty. The crimes of homicide, however, that are stipulated in the penal code include homicides, parricides, which means killing of a parent, preparation of homicide, inducing or aiding suicide, homicide with consent, and attempts of homicide. Not all those types of homicides are subject to the death penalty, as a Japanese professor, Mori, recently wrote in a paper that was published in 2020 about the deterrent effect of death penalty in Japan. For instance, preparation of homicide, inducing or aiding suicide, and homicide with consent are not eligible for death penalty. If you look at people who are on death row in Japan right now, you'll see that more than 90% of those 118 cases involve two victims at least. So that doesn't mean that if somebody killed only one person, he cannot get death penalty, because that happened. It doesn't happen only in murder cases. For instance, on death row now, it's a person who was involved in Red Army activities in the 70s and got death penalty. Arson as a cause of death, it's a crime that is eligible for death. Murder that took place during the commission of another crime, like robbery, for instance, that ended up robbery and murder, it's more likely to get death penalty. Building bombs to people who received the death penalty because of that. Parricides also. Murder for hire was a case of a convict who killed a woman, so that wasn't more than one person, but the commission of the crime was during a parole period. He was paroled. He had a life sentence and got out of prison and killed this older lady, and then he got death penalty. So in general, murder cases, more than two people being killed, they are more likely to secure a death penalty. But again, a Japanese scholar, Norio Takahashi, was talking about 9 criteria. They are generally used in deliberations. So lay judges in particular and the professional judges, they make an assessment based on the degree of viciousness, the motivation behind the crime, the manner in which the victim has been killed, the outcome of the crime, meaning the number of victims, and this is considered like the most important motives on deciding criminal liability. They also take into account the feelings of the victim's family members, the impact of the crime on the Japanese society, the defendant's age. I don't know, we would expect that they would be more lenient if a person is younger, but as I was saying earlier, there are 5 individuals on death row now who committed the crime as minors. Also, they consider the previous criminal records and the degree of remorse shown by the defendant. So I don't know exactly who gets life in prison and who doesn't. I couldn't find information about that. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but based on the data included in the study that I mentioned earlier, written by Professor Mori, who conducted a time series analysis of murder rates and the effect of death sentences and life imprisonment, it looked like the average rate for life imprisonment and death sentences was pretty much the same, if I remember correctly. But again, I suspect that if there is only one victim involved, that defendant is more likely to get life in prison. Different from the United States, in Japan, there isn't a sentence like life in prison without the possibility of parole that is here. But when you get a life sentence, based on what I've read, the chances to get out earlier of the prison are pretty slim. But around 10 people get out before they die every year. So 10 who get a life sentence. And in any case, the imprisonment rate in Japan is pretty low, especially compared to the United States that keeps incarcerating people. So the imprisonment rate here, it's about 665 per 100,000 people, where in Japan, it's 39 per 100,000. Yeah, so I couldn't find any information about the actual number of people who have life sentences in Japan, but probably it's not very high. It might be comparable to those who are on death row.
I see. Thank you. Let's turn to your 2020 article now, titled Public Opinion and the Death Penalty in Japan. Your study takes a look at trends amongst retentionists and abolitionists, that is, those for and against the death penalty. Could you give us an overview of your findings?
Yeah, sure. Ted Hughes and I, Ted is my colleague, we work on this analysis a couple of years ago. And as I mentioned earlier, I was planning to analyze data on death penalty in Japan for some time, but I couldn't find the proper data. And our study is based on Japan's General Social Survey, which is very similar to the General Social Survey that is used in the United States on a yearly basis. And it's a secondary data analysis. And the survey that we used was from 2010. At that time, it was only one more recent available from 2012. And I remember one of the anonymous reviewers asked why we didn't use the more recent one. And I didn't, because the most recent one didn't include any information about the new lay judge system. And I was interested in that particular issue. So the main goal of the analysis was to identify the characteristics of people who have different opinions toward death penalty. Most studies tend to use the dichotomy and say, well, who are those who favor and who are those who oppose the sentence? I was interested in those who are undecided because they can go one way or another, and especially if they are nonprofit organizations in Japan and other groups who would like to see a change in the legislation and would like to see death penalty abolished, they might be interested in focusing their attention on this group of people who are undecided. In the case, they are more likely to be like those who oppose death penalty. I didn't know what findings are going to be. So studies that try to explain variations in attitudes toward punishment and harsh punishments in particular, like death penalty, generally used two theoretical perspectives. So in order to understand death penalty, social scientists argue that there are differences in opinions as a result of people's differences in basic political and social values. And this is called the symbolic perspective, but also as a result of variations in people's crime victimization experience, crime concerns in general. This is called the instrumental perspective. And according to the instrumental hypothesis and according to the pragmatic theory formulated by Tyler and Weber in the 80s, citizens who favor the death penalty do so pragmatically. So this is an utilitarian explanation of public attitudes for death penalty. So people favor death penalty because they believe that would have a deterrent effect. A crime deterrent effect would reduce crime levels. So the variables that we included in the analysis were trying to reflect those perspectives. So some of the variables as they relate to instrumental factors or relate to instrumental factors like being a crime victim and having a high level of fear of crime and showing dissatisfaction with crime control were part of the instrumental factors, and social trust. So social trust as a measure of social capital, for instance, institutional trust, civic engagement, religiosity were variables that would capture the symbolic perspective. And before I tell you briefly what the findings were, I can give you a short picture of the sample that was used. So the sample included about 2,500 individuals, who was representative of Japan's adult population at the time. And respondents were asked their attitude toward death penalty, and different from some official polls conducted every 5 years in Japan that ask questions in a manner that it's a little bit strange. In the General Social Survey, respondents were asked if they agree with death penalty, if they disagree, or if they don't know. So 65.2% of the time show support for death penalty, and of relatively large numbers, about 1 in 4 respondents, 26%, were undecided. And those who disagree with death penalty were about 9%, so 8.7%. Crime victimization experience, so respondents were asked, and for that particular variable, I remember I used 2 questions. So during the past year, did anyone take something directly from you by using force? Or during the past year, did anyone break into your house? And those who answered yes at any of those 2 questions were labeled victims of crime. So only 3.3% of the respondents acknowledged some victimization. Which was very interesting was that more than half of the respondents, 58%, show a relatively high level of fear of crime, fear of walking alone at night in your own neighborhood, which is generally a question that is frequently used when assessing one's level of fear of crime. So almost 59%, so 58.6% said they're afraid to walk at night. About a third of the respondents show dissatisfaction with crime control measures. About 65% show more punitive attitudes. They said that courts should be harsher. And when asked about the lay judge system, again, the survey was conducted in 2010, and the system was introduced the year before. So 50.5% said that they were hesitate to recommend the death penalty, even if 65% originally said that they would favor the death penalty. Regarding symbolic factors, the level of institutional trust in 3 governmental institutions wasn't particularly high in Japan. So on a scale from 1 to 3 was below the midpoint, was 1.61. Trust in courts, trust in the police can be considered average. Social trust, which I assess based on a question regarding one's views of humankind, was higher than average. So on a scale from 1 to 4, where 4 would be like the midpoint, the average for that was like 4.64. So indicating that in general, Japanese trust their fellow citizens. Regarding civic engagement, which in this particular case, the question that we used to measure civic engagement was one that asked respondents if they would support the citizen judge system. most of them didn't at the time. So 43% said that they would support, and the majority, 57%, said they didn't. The one's religious practice was used as a measure of religiosity. So respondents who said that they practice a religion were compared to those who said that they don't have any religious affiliation, or that the family belongs to some religious denomination, but they don't practice. So those who said that they practice a religion, the percentage was quite low, 12.4% in the sample. About 54% of the respondents were females, and about 10% of them were 30 years old and younger. And age was used in this case because some prior studies conducted in Japan, I believe, was a study conducted in the 70s, and they found that younger people tend to have different opinions toward death penalty than people who are 30 and older. Other variables that are typically used in studies conducted in the United States weren't included here because preliminary analysis showed that there are not significant differences. For instance, in the United States, Republicans and people who have more conservative views are more likely to support death penalty, while in Japan, those with liberal views or having liberal views was positively correlated to opposition to death penalty, but the correlation was so small, was close to zero, that didn't have any impact. Now, regarding the findings of the multivariate analysis, there are three comparisons possibly between opponents and supporters, and those who were undecided and supporters of death penalty, and undecided compared to those who showed opposition toward death penalty. I'm just going to talk about two comparisons that I think were more interesting. So based on our results, those who show support for death penalty in Japan were more likely to be dissatisfied with crime control policies. They had stronger punitive attitudes. They are more likely to recommend death penalty if elected to serve as a lay judge. They had a lower level of social trust. They were less supportive of the lay judge system, the mixed criminal justice system, and they're significantly less likely to practice a religion. Being a crime victim and having a higher level of crime didn't differentiate opponents from supporters in Japan. When we look at differences or similarities between the undecided and the supporters, we could conclude that the undecided were somewhat closer to respondents who opposed death penalty than they were to the others. So they were less likely to have punitive attitudes compared to supporters. They were less likely to recommend death if they're to be elected a lay judge. They had a significantly higher level of institutional trust. However, they are less likely to trust the police. They are less likely to want to be involved or to serve on the lay judge system, and they are more likely to be women. So they, as I said, in many respects, they're closer to those who are the undecided. They are closer to respondents who show opposition to death penalty.
It's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much. An intriguing element of your study, as you mentioned earlier, was the new citizen judge panel, something similar to the jury system in the UK or USA, asking respondents whether they would recommend the death penalty if on the panel. Your findings suggest that despite the majority of respondents being retentionists, more than half expressed a reluctance to seek the death penalty. So I was just wondering, how do you explain this?
Well, I can only guess. As I said earlier, the majority of the respondents show no interest in supporting the system, which is not surprising. There is a book that was published in 2000 Japan by Vinkan, Nishimura, and White about civic engagement in contemporary Japan. And they are saying that since the early 80s, the overall population involved in civic activities has remained pretty stable, around 25%. Now, to answer your question, that might be Vinkan and his colleagues. They argue that Japanese people generally hesitate to exercise influence in the public sphere because they're inclined to believe that experts should be in charge of politics, governance, and civil service. So that might explain why they were reluctant to participate and also to express an opinion. I mean, it's different when you ask in general if you support something, but then when you have to imagine yourself actually having the responsibility of someone's life, and taking a decision that would alter somebody's life, I suspect everybody would be more cautious. So I'm not surprised to see the difference in percentages. The fact that they are less supportive of the death penalty. But obviously things change a little bit. In the years that follow that survey, it looks like I told you that punishments seem to be harsher since that less as the systems had been implemented in Japan.
I see. Now, being based in the USA, I'm sure you must have thought about capital punishment in America when conducting your research. Are there any interesting similarities or differences that stood out for you in the attitudes towards capital punishment between Japan and the USA?
Yes, there are similarities if you look at those who support death penalty. So both states have death penalty statutes, and both countries argue that one reason they continue to do that is because of the extensive public support, which is very legitimate explanation, because in any democracy, the policies or law should reflect the opinion of the majority. In the United States, however, the support for death penalty seems to be a little bit lower than it is in Japan. And it was the last survey conducted by Pew Research Center in 2021, that 60% of the Americans support death penalty. In the years before, because in these countries since 1936, there are Gallup polls conducted, and all the time respondents were asked about death penalty, if they favor or if they oppose that. And a few years ago, support for the sentence decreased below 60%. So if I remember correctly, in 2017, only 55% of Americans show support for the death penalty. Now, in Japan, the government is conducting every 5 years surveys, and they include questions about death penalty. And the last one was conducted in 2020. And consistently, those surveys were saying that about 80% of the public is showing support for the death penalty. But I think I mentioned earlier, the question that they asked were a little bit strange to me. So respondents had to agree or disagree or select one of those options. And the first one was death penalty should be abolished for all circumstances. The second option was death penalty is unavoidable in some cases. And the third option was, I don't know, I can decide, or it depends, or something like that. And one Japanese scholar who published a book and conducted, Maisato is her name, who got her PhD in UK actually, she was saying, that it's one thing to ask somebody, do you favor or oppose? It's a pretty clear question. But to say something like death penalty is unavoidable in some circumstances, it's pretty vague. It's of course more people are going to agree with that. But when you restrict that death penalty should be abolished, for all crime, people are forced to be more cautious if they would say yes. But something that was interesting at the recent poll, they asked respondents if they were to choose between death penalty and life in prison without parole, what do you prefer? And I think that's the first time that that question has been used. So it's a small sign that something might change, that officials, took into consideration research that was conducted in Japan and the criticism of researchers like May Sato and Paul Bacon made and others. And support for death penalty from 80.7% dropped to 52% when respondents had that alternative answer. So that's one similarity, that in both countries, the majority of the population tend to be supportive of death penalty. Based on the results of our study, if you recall, I was saying that fear of crime and victimization, experiencing victimization, didn't differentiate supporters from the undecided from the opponents of death penalty. Studies conducted in the United States also found that those instrumental factors didn't have an effect on structuring opinions. However, similar to studies conducted here, dissatisfaction with crime control was predicting support for death penalty. Civic participation in a few studies that look at the effect of this variable on punitive attitudes also found that people who are civically engaged are less punitive than others. And religiosity was, again, documented in studies conducted in the United States. So religious people, even if they are different of opinions, for instance, in Japan, you have people who are Buddhists and Shintoists, or people who practice both spiritual traditions, and they are very different. Shintoists tend to support death penalty, where Buddhists do not. However, there is some common denominator, and individuals who tend to be more religious, they believe in forgiveness, and maybe that's why those who acknowledge or report high levels of religiosity tend to oppose death penalty. Regarding differences, research conducted in the United States over the past decades, revealed that proponents of the death penalty are more likely to be males, older individuals, whites, Republicans, and persons who identify with conservative religious denominations. So Neo-Protestant churches in particular, who tend to be supportive of harsher punishments in general. In Japan, however, there are no gender-based differences. Women's opinions were not significantly different from males' opinions. Women tend to, in general, studies show that they are less supportive of harsher punishments than men are. Race in Japan is not a relevant factor, so it couldn't be used here. You have a pretty ethnically homogeneous population. So other factors like education, socioeconomic status, political attitudes that I mentioned earlier didn't generate differences in opinions like research conducted in the United States does. Something that is also a little bit different in Japan compared to the United States based on opinions, I think that you could see opinions more stabilized in Japan over the years. And I believe interest in death penalty, it's much, much lower in Japan than it is in the United States. And research conducted in Japan on the issue, it's pretty limited. And that might be because the visibility of the measure is different than it is in the United States. Many observers say that the death penalty in Japan is very secretive, that defendants don't know when they are going to be executed, that the morning of the execution, they can be announced. Their lawyers or the family, they only announce that the person has been executed after the execution actually took place. So there are a lot of controversial issues. And the fact that many of those convictions are based on convictions, and many suspect that those are forced convictions. I mean, if you keep somebody for days and days in the pre-trial period, and at some point they give up, they don't have access to counsel. Until recently, nobody was recording or videotaped the interrogations of the defendant. So there are many questions about the process, and even the fact that when they are convicted, they are not considered prisoners, which it's not the case in the United States. I mean, you have high security prisons and where death row inmates, have to be. But in Japan, there are like 7 detention centers that are special for death row inmates. And they spend a lot of time in solitary confinement, and they are allowed about 2 days a week to exercise. They have the right to have only 3 books and cannot watch television. And 26% of those on death row in Japan are people who are 70 years old or older. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I remember in 2019, Pope Francis had a 4-day visit to Japan, and he expressed his disagreement with death penalty and called it inhumane, and wanted to meet one of the death row inmates who's now like 86 years old. He claims he's in prison since 1968, and he kept claiming his innocence. And at some point he was paroled, then was revoked, because that's something that you don't see in the United States. For instance, cases here, as a prosecutor, you can try a case as a capital case, or you don't. And those social scientists who oppose death penalty in the United States many times claim that, and I'm talking here about Professor Skiles and Vito, for instance, who wrote about that and wrote about the capriciousness of death penalty in the United States. So you have cases that are eligible for death penalty, and about 3% of them get death, because the process here is just so much more expensive. To prosecute a case as a capital case, it's extremely expensive because of the legal stipulations, and because when that happens, you have to bring experts, and you have the number of appeals that you have the right to, so it's lengthier. So that's why it's much more expensive. So I remember that when I was in the doctoral program, I did a cost efficiency analysis that I wish I still have on death penalty. And I found out how much more expensive it was to prosecute a case as a capital case than to put a person in prison for life without the possibility of parole. I don't know what are the costs involved in Japan. I mean, I just couldn't find any information about that. I don't know if the officials, they are willing to publish anything about that. So there are differences, and there are social science research. And as you probably saw or heard, most studies about death penalty have been conducted in the United States because there are more problems here. Even now, if you look, you have African Americans in particular that are overrepresented on death row among inmates at the federal and state level as well. And about 1.6% of people on death row has been exonerated. In Japan, there isn't much talk about that, about mistakes. And something that I found strange, and I started on the long discussion, was that I don't think in the United States somebody who gets a life sentence and appeals that and then to get death penalty. But in Japan, you can. So you get a life sentence, in the district court, and you appeal that because you said, well, I didn't commit the crime, and it goes to the higher courts, and they give you a death sentence. So that happened several times. So if you look at those people who are on death row, you'd see that they have those sentences reversed, where it happened the other way around also, but only 3 times since 1945, when the Supreme Court reversed some sentences. But most likely, if you take the risk to appeal a pretty harsh sentence, you might get death. So there are differences in the way people react. And as I said, the fact that the support for death penalty decreased from 80% in the 90s to 60% in 2021 could be partially explained, by public's increased willingness to follow the international trend that show a steady worldwide decline in the acceptance of death penalty. And Japanese are probably less willing to do that. Even if Sato, in one of her studies, where she interviewed people who were supporting or opposing death penalty, found that respondents said that if the government would change the policy, and abolish death penalty, they would support the decision. But there are differences, as I said, because in Japan, there aren't too many studies that actually document the impact of death penalty. Now, at the last survey, when I'm talking about a governmental survey, when people were asked why they support death penalty or why they think it's a necessity, and that's something, the motive that was mentioned at the previous survey as well, they're talking about the family of the defendant, that it wouldn't be fair to them, that they're thinking about the family. So not so much about the deterrent effect of the death penalty. That was like the last reason, which it's very hard to demonstrate. I mean, Professor Mori's studies show he found that was no significant relationship between capital sentences rate and murder rate in Japan. So in other words, it doesn't matter, as it should be. Some people argue that if you have harsher sentences, criminals would be deterred and people would start committing crimes. Now, in Japan, you had that trend that show for the past 60 years, you have a decrease in murders consistently. In Japan, in 2020, there were 929 murders. The clearance rate in Japan is fantastic. In the United States, it's a little bit higher, above 50%. In Japan, is over 90%. The conviction rate is 99%. But there are 929 murders in Japan, and there are 20,000 something in the United States. But the Japanese still think that crime is increasing. And it's something that it's not unusual because that's pretty much a common opinion in other places. But it's strange that in such a safe place, people continue to believe that crime is increasing.
Yeah, and there may be a correlation in the fact that there's a lot of data being published by the prosecution, as you said earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Professor Mori, he identified only 3 studies, and 2 of them were published in Japan. But, when you do those sophisticated quantitative analysis, the ordinary citizen, once they don't have access to them, and then if they do, they can understand the statistical procedures, and he also found, some serious methodological flaws. But he published in a journal, University of Chicago Press here. And I said, well, I wonder how many Japanese scholars or people, policymakers are going to read that, to look at your findings, because it's very hard to determine the deterrence effect of death penalty. How can you do that, Because you have people who are in prison for life and people who are put on death, And how can you detach the two? How would you know which one was more effective than the other? And in his analysis, he controlled for that. So he was calculating, the marginal effect of death penalty and found no effect. But as I said, he found that with an increase in the rate of life sentences, the robbery murder rate would significantly decrease, which is a very important finding for policymakers in Japan. Again, those are not common events, even if rank officials and ministers of justice in Japan, they're saying, well, we maintain the death penalty because there are so many atrocious crimes in the country. And of course, they're highly publicized, and people see all those stories on TV or on the internet, and they have a distorted image of reality. And that doesn't happen only in Japan. It happens pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering all of my questions, Viviana. Before we finish the episode, could you share with us what other projects you're currently working on?
Well, I'm working with several doctoral students, and sometimes I need to adapt to their needs as much as I can. I am working on a project that is dear to me, on a manuscript that I can manage to finish for one reason or another. It's based on a country-level analysis. It includes over 180 countries, and I'm looking at the effects of gender inequality on the gender gap in homicide. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. In most countries, men tend to be victims of homicides more than women are. And my research findings indicate that gender equality, that's an indicator. That's a UN indicator, and it's used in many studies. So when men and women, or countries where men and women tend to have more equal positions, tend to have lower murder rates for men and for women. So there is a negative relationship between the two. However, something that has been noted years and years ago by a Swedish scholar continues to happen. The gender gap, so the closeness in lethal victimization rate between men and women tend to be smaller in some countries and larger in others. And people would suspect, well, yeah, women are more likely to kill probably in countries that, they have those patriarchal tendencies and women are inferior positions, and actually doesn't happen. So in Western European countries have like the smallest gap in victimization between men and women. And regarding Japan, I saved the data before I knew I was going to talk to you. I didn't have to analyze. That's a more recent Joint Social Survey that I found, and I would be interested to look at fear of crime in Japan and the predictors of fear of crime. There aren't too many variables that I use, but probably I would look at exposure to media exposure and the effect on that on fear of crime. Because I suspect that in addition to victimization, which again, you'd expect that people have been victims of crime to have higher levels of fear, but it doesn't happen. It happens in some instances and it doesn't in others. So there isn't a consistency in results. So that's the next study that I will do with Japan.
Fascinating. Lots to look forward to then. Thank you for joining me again, Viviana. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You can find a link to Viviana's research profile in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe on japaninnorwich.org or on your preferred podcast provider for updates on new episodes. Join us for our next episode with Brittany Rapone, PhD candidate at the School of Social Sciences at Oxford Brookes University, to discuss pets and animal cafes in Japan as a form of self-care. We hope you'll join us then. Thank you for listening.